it does break my heart that if you're sharing you had an abortion, that there could be a child, I don't know how old they'd be, 10 years old today, who would be cheering you on saying, go get him, Mom, you got this.
I can promise you that would not be the case. With your statistic and your information,
your baby had a right to live.
You don't get to speak for my child. You don't get to speak for my child. Let's start right there.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Case for Life show. I'm Scott Klusendorf, your host. It's a joy to have you with us today. I watched a fabulous, very interesting video clip this last week featuring Lila Rose, who's the head of Live Action, a very good pro-life organization. Many of you know Lila from the days of doing undercover work where she and her team would go into abortion clinics and catch them selling fetal body parts and things like that, and selling abortions to underage girls. I really like what she does. I like her work. And she did something recently that I thought was really gutsy and really a good model for how we ought to think about engagement. She invited 25 very hardcore pro-abortion activists to come to an event where she would sit in the middle of the room, and one at a time they would get to come up and answer her or make claims about her work, or generally they would come up and attack her pro-life position. And she basically called this thing Surrounded. It's a neat little thing to view. She's sitting in the middle of the room at a table with one chair on the opposite side of the table, where one at a time these activists got to come up and raise whatever questions or make comments. Usually they made comments, not ask questions. And she would engage them. That's gutsy. I salute that. And as I watched that, I thought I'd like to comment on some of the things the people said. I'm not here to talk about how Lila did. She did fine. This is about some of the things the people were saying that wanted to engage Lila, and they thought they were bringing persuasive arguments, and they were not. So the first thing that you notice is, in the clip, the very first woman who comes up is responding to a statement Lila made that went like this: you don't have a right to kill your own child. Your child has a right to life. Okay, that's Lila's claim, and she backs it up with an argument. The response, though, was really curious. The first woman that came up was visibly angry. And by the way, almost all of these people were angry. They didn't even attempt to just sit down and try to, cash out what Lila's position was. They just wanted to react with anger, which is pretty much what you see on the street. And there are reasons for this that we've covered in other episodes of the show. But what I want you to see is this. The first person that came up said the following: you don't get to speak for my child. That was her response to Lila's claim that her child had a right to life. The response was, well, you don't get to speak for my child. Now, this is a very curious response, and right away you should have bells and alarms going off in your mind. Notice the language used here. The woman used the word my child. So we're talking here about a human being that even the person that is interrogating Lila at this point seems to concede. She used the word child to reference the thing that would be killed by the abortion. Now, there's a lot of things here to unpack, but let me just start with the biggies here. In addition to the fact that her language betrays her own position by calling this a child, notice what abortion advocates are really arguing for in many cases today. We are no longer arguing bodily autonomy. What pro-abortionists want is a right to a dead child. And their view of autonomy goes way beyond what it used to be. The old argument went like this: even if the unborn are human, so the argument went, they do not have a right to use the woman's body to sustain their own lives. The mother may withhold that support if she wishes. And abortion, on this line of argument, properly understood, is simply refusing to support an unwanted intruder or parasite or whatever they want to call it. That bodily rights argument has been thrown under the bus, and I'm going to give you more examples of that in a minute. But the language here shows this newer way of looking at abortion. It's a right to a dead child, not merely the so-called right to be relieved of pregnancy, not merely the right not to be forced to use my body to sustain another human being. When this woman calls her offspring a child and says, you have no right to tell me that I can't kill my own child, we've reached a new level of discourse in the abortion debate, and it's not good. But I want to ask another question here. Where does this so-called right to a dead child come from? The person commenting in the clip did not even attempt to go there, but people today love to pluck rights out of thin air. It's like, if I simply feel something, I have a right to it. If I feel I no longer want to live, I have a right to doctor-assisted suicide, or I have a right to euthanasia. I have a right to force a physician to kill me. And all of this is based on an idea that rights entail desires. In other words, if I desire something, you must grant me the right to do it. If I desire to be a woman, even though I have a man's body, you must, under threat of law or cancellation, you must acknowledge that I have a right to identify as whatever gender I want. But where do rights come from? This is where people get all tied up in knots. Because if I were to ask this woman, tell me, where does your right to intentionally kill your child come from? Her answer will likely be, well, the Supreme Court said I had that right in Roe v. Wade. Okay, well, here's the obvious problem with grounding rights in government. The same government that grants a right to something can take it away. Now, the more fundamental way of understanding this, the traditional way American law understood fundamental rights, was this. There are certain rights that are pre-political. For example, the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Think of the Declaration of Independence and you'll know what I'm talking about. But what is going on here in today's world is we're not grounding rights in a traditional sense that said your rights exist from your human nature, meaning they spring from your human nature. You have a right to life that is pre-political. Government doesn't grant that right. It recognizes and protects it. You have that right in virtue of being a human being. And it doesn't matter what country you're from, your nationality, your race, or your creed. That natural right to life exists because it springs from your human nature. Humans, by nature, have certain rights. And that's what our founders were arguing in the Declaration of Independence. So where does this alleged right to an abortion come from? Or in this case, as the woman conceded, a right to a dead child. She calls her unborn offspring a child, but then is making it very clear only she has autonomy over what happens to that child. When she says, you don't get to speak for my child, so the way we speak for her child is to give her the right to kill the child. Now, there's also an element of this that some of you may recognize. You could also say, well, she's simply assuming the unborn aren't human. In reality, she would never say that if we were talking about killing her 2-year-old. And that may be true. And it's a fact that most people who argue for abortion, at the street level anyway, not in academia, but at least at the street level, have not been schooled in moral logic. They don't know how to argue propositionally, so they simply assume the unborn aren't human. I mean, would this woman make the same claim if the topic on the table was, should I have a right to kill my 5-year-old? Well, I don't think so. Although maybe she would, I don't know. But it's still a radical claim to say, that's a child I have in there, and only I get to speak for that child. And if I choose to speak for that child by intentionally killing him, you have no say in that. But that woman would not argue that way if we were talking about killing 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds. She would likely, I hope, say no, the right to intentionally kill that child does not exist. But if she's already conceded that the child in her womb is in fact a child, then how is that any different than killing a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old? And the answer is it's not. She's already conceded it's a human being and that it's a child, to use her own language. Well, why then do we get to kill that child? Now, I mentioned a moment ago that abortion advocates have seem to be staking out a new position. And really, it's not terribly new. They've felt this all along. They're just being more vocal about it now. And that new position is you not only have a right to an abortion, in other words, a right to be relieved of pregnancy, You have a right to a dead child. Only you get to decide what happens to that living child. Now, last week, Senate Democrats in the U.S. Senate voted in total lockstep. 100% of Senate Democrats voted to deny legal protections to children who survive abortion procedures. Now, keep in mind what this is getting at here. These are not children in the womb attached to their mothers, and the mothers are, giving them support by use of their body. These are kids outside of the womb now who are on the table. They've been delivered alive, having somehow managed to survive an abortion procedure. And Senate Democrats said, no, we will not protect them. I mean, that sounds an awful lot to me like what they're arguing for, and what they're trying to enshrine here is a right to a dead child, not a right to merely relieve the woman of pregnancy, which is bad enough. But from this, the discussion with Lila got very interesting, and I'm going to pick that up when we come back from our break. We're going to take a break right now, and I want to do two things when we come back. I want to highlight another conversation Lila had, and again, I thought this was incredibly courageous of her, brave of her to invite these people to come and challenge her. She's by herself. There's 25 of them, and she's there in the middle of the room on her own defending her pro-life views. Salute to Lila. Good work. What I want to do, though, is pick up another claim that was thrown at her, and it's one I suspect many of you have heard as well. We're going to unpack that claim because it's utterly fallacious. And then the other thing I want to do is talk about another kind of wave of thought creeping into the abortion debate coming from Christians. And it goes like this. We need a more nuanced approach to abortion, and we need to recognize that there's a lot of mystery involved in the status of the unborn. I'm going to take those two claims up when we come back. I'll see you in just a minute. If you have not already done so, please visit the page of our primary sponsor, Life Training Institute. There you will find information on our speakers who go into schools, who speak at Christian worldview forums, and educate others how to make a case for the pro-life view persuasively. If you've not already done so, please visit the Life Training Institute website. Another thing you'll find there are the schedules of our speakers. You'll find out where we're going to be, what we've done, and the kinds of messages we're trying to deliver. Really hope you'll go visit our website at prolifetraining.com. Welcome back, everyone. Like I said before the break, I want to take on two additional things that we need to think about regarding the current state of the abortion debate. The first is another questioner who approached Lila Rose at this forum, where she courageously surrounded herself with 25 hardcore abortion activists who got to ask her questions, although none of them really asked questions. They just made statements. Like the one we referenced before the break, the woman saying, "You don't get to speak for my child." Now, one other thing about that I want to come back to before we jump to the next two items. Ask yourself this question. Was that an argument or a mere assertion? When someone says, "You don't get to speak for my child, I can do with my child whatever I want," or they say something like, "I have a right to an abortion," is that a real argument? Actually, it's not. It's just an assertion. And the burden of proof is not on Lila to refute that. The burden of proof is on the person making the claim. In this case, the woman who asserts, "You don't get to speak for my child." Really, the hidden and undefended premise there in that assertion is this: only I get to decide whether my child lives or dies. Now, that is not defended anywhere in the woman's claim. She just asserts that she has a right to do what she wants with her own child. We've already talked about some problems with that, but here's another biggie with it. It's not an actual argument. It's an assertion. If I say I have a right to go kill my 10-year-old, that's not an argument, that's an assertion. Why? Because I've given you no evidence as to why I have that right. I've given you no explanation for where that right comes from. I mean, where does the right to an abortion come from? Nobody wants to grapple with that question. We've already shown that if it comes from the government, that's not going to work. So Where does this alleged right to an abortion come from? Or in this case, the right to kill her own child. This is a mere assertion. And really, I think you're well within your rights when someone does this to just look at them and say, do it politely, but say, what do you mean by right? And where does that right to an abortion come from? And then you could also give the hammer here and say, why should I believe what you just said? It's a nice assertion, but I need you to argue for it. Now, here's the difference between an argument and an assertion. An assertion is, I have a right to do with my kid whatever I want. That's an assertion. There's no argument there. Here's an argument. It's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is wrong. Notice we got premise, premise, conclusion. Okay, that's a formal way of stating an argument. Now, that argument can be evaluated for validity and soundness and clarity, but notice it's at least advancing a line of thinking. There's a formal way of presenting what you're arguing for in this case. That isn't happening in this form with Lila. People are coming up and just making whatever statement they want, and she very graciously allows them to make their points. I think her demeanor here is very good. She's not defensive. She's just sitting there and engaging them, and I, again, salute her for having the courage to do this. But these people that are coming to challenge her are not making arguments. They're making assertions. And one of the best ways to deal with that is to simply say, well, tell me why I should believe a thing like that when they say their assertion. Women have a right to choose. Oh, really? Why would you believe that? Choose what? Go ahead and press them to actually argue for their view and give reasons for why you ought to accept what they're saying. You don't need to accept their assertion just because they make it. Now, another thing that came up in this forum with Lila, another person who was there came up to the chair, sat down, and looked at Lila and said, well, how many kids have you adopted? And basically she was saying, there goes your whole pro-life argument. You haven't even adopted any kids. And yet here you are trying to say that it's wrong to kill children we don't want. This is really a laughable argument, really. It's an assertion, again. But look, all you got to do here is look at the person and say, how does my alleged unwillingness to adopt a child justify you killing him? The argument, once again, assumes the unborn aren't human. Would anybody say that we can go to an orphanage and kill all the kids in there because no one wants to adopt them? No, they only say this about unborn humans. But again, how does my alleged unwillingness to adopt a child justify you killing him? And of course, there's no answer you could give here. I mean, imagine if I said to you, unless you agree to adopt my 3 sons by noon tomorrow, I shall execute them. Now, that's not going to happen because they're all bigger than me, but play along for the moment. If you turn down my ultimatum, am I justified killing my kids? Of course not. I mean, the homeless are unwanted. Can we kill them? This entire line of reasoning does nothing to refute the pro-life argument. It's question-begging in that it assumes the unborn are not human. That hasn't been argued for. It's simply assumed. Now, I think, too, you could also point out that even if Lila were the worst person in the world, she doesn't give a rip about kids once they're born. Let's say she was that kind of person. She absolutely is not, but assume she was. How would that refute her pro-life argument that it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being? Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. It wouldn't. At best, this is a lazy ad hominem attack on the character of Lila. It does nothing to address her actual argument. And one thing that I found that angry pro-aborts never understand, they cannot get it through their skulls that arguments stand or fall apart from the people making them. For example, let me give an example here that pro-lifers sometimes bring up that is a fallacious way to argue. They will say, well, you know, Margaret Sanger was a racist. I don't like it when pro-lifers use that argument, and here's why. It doesn't help the pro-life argument that it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. It doesn't help us solidify that argument by pointing out that one of our opponents happened to be a racist. Okay, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. How does that make abortion wrong? Could a good argument still come from a bad person? And the answer is yes. As I've said before, if Joseph Stalin argues that slavery is wrong and makes a good argument for it, that argument stands apart from the fact that he as an individual enslaved millions of Soviet peasants and killed them, by the way, starved them to death in many cases. He was responsible for the deaths of millions of his own citizens during the 1930s and 40s. And yet that doesn't mean that his argument against slavery, if he were to have made one, would be bad because he didn't live it out consistently. So even on the consistency question, it's very easy to point out you're not going to refute the pro-life argument that it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being by attacking pro-lifers about how they live out their views. Maybe Lila does, maybe Lila never adopts a child. I don't know. But even if she didn't, that wouldn't refute her argument that it's wrong to intentionally kill the unborn. The critics are just being very, very lazy here. Now, another thing that came up was illegal abortion. One of the questioners said, you know, you're Catholic. You claim to be pro-life. How pro-life is it for you to look the other way while millions of women die in the back alleys of states that have prohibited abortion because they can't get safe, legal abortions? And my first question is, what do you mean by safe? Safe for whom? The child? Notice this objection assumes the unborn are not human. It's assuming, at the very minimum, that unborn female humans are not, in fact, human. Because if that were the case, shouldn't you be arguing for their safety as well? And of course, that's not what's in play here. But why should the law be faulted for making it more risky for one human to intentionally kill another completely innocent one? I mean, we don't legalize bank robbery to make it safer for felons. Now, before you go off and say, oh, you're comparing women who have abortions to felons who rob banks. No, I'm simply pointing out that the objection assumes the unborn are not human. That must be argued for, not merely assumed. By the way, we've taken this up in previous podcasts, and we'll deal with it on this show at a later date, where we go through the statistical analysis to show that there never was a time in the U.S. where thousands of women were dying every year from illegal abortions. Did some women die? Yes, and that's a tragedy. We can all admit that that's a tragedy. But to say 5,000 to 10,000 deaths a year, that's utter baloney, and we'll pick that up on another show when we have a moment. What I want to shift to now is another conversation I was party to. It happened this last weekend. I met with a friend who does not hold my view on abortion and who is what most of you would consider a progressive. He is on the political left, argues for almost all of the leftist positions. He's theologically progressive, meaning he doesn't hold to the key doctrines of the Christian faith. He rejects substitutionary atonement as being divine child abuse. He thinks that the gospel needs to be repackaged in ways that appeal more to progressives. And of course, he is not pro-life. He's pro-choice on abortion. Now, some of you might be thinking, why would I even have a friend like that? Shouldn't I just cut those people off? No. Listen to me very carefully. It does you no good to cut people off who disagree with you. Keep the relationship channel open. Be willing to sit down and have some conversations. And actually, he and I have gone back and forth on abortion, both in print and in person. And I think the discussion has evolved in a very healthy way, because now we didn't start off this way, but now we have agreed that the issue of abortion comes down to the status of the unborn. Are they human beings or not? And there's no way to escape that issue. And the good thing is he now recognizes that based on our discussion. But the reason we've been able to progress that discussion is because both of us, and I give him credit here too, he and I have both gone out of our way to be civil, to be charitable to each other, to say, look, let's try to build a friendship here, even though we disagree at the idea level. Because what happens so much in discussions on abortion, everything gets personal. You know, the pro-abortionist comes to you and says, you just hate women. You want them to die. You don't respect their dignity. You're the worst person in the world. And the pro-lifer says, well, you're just a baby murderer. How can I even talk to somebody who supports killing babies? That isn't going to advance the conversation. I believe in asking very tough questions at the idea level, but doing your best to be charitable at the personal level. Greg Koukl teaches this very well at Stand to Reason when he teaches his ambassador skills material of learning to be gracious to individuals, but be tough on the ideas you're advancing. And I agree with that. That's exactly the way to go. But one of the things my friend was arguing is that we need a more nuanced position on abortion, that the beginning of human life is really a mysterious thing. After all, the Bible doesn't directly teach the unborn are human, or it doesn't even mention the word abortion. Therefore, it seems to him that there should be some mystery involved as to when life begins and what the child in the womb is. He isn't comfortable with the hardcore pro-abortion view that that's just a hunk of meat in there and you can stab it through the heart and dismember it, no big deal. But he doesn't want to acknowledge the clear science of embryology. And I want to stress it is clear. There is no debate here that from the earliest stages of development, you have a distinct, living, and whole human being. There's no mystery here. Now, I think here's what's happening. I'll just tell you what I think is happening here. I think what's happening is that because of the direction of our conversation moving in a very positive way, meaning him coming to recognize that you cannot escape the central question, what is the unborn, that now he has to make an argument that somehow that thing in the womb might not be fully human the way you and I are. And he is starting to grapple with that. And he has rightly recognized that these arguments people try to come up with for saying it's not human really don't work, that the whole person-human divide that Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, and others put forward, that, yeah, the unborn are biologically human, but they're not persons. He's cognizant of the fact that those arguments fall apart. So what he's done is he's punted to mystery, to say, well, we just don't know what that early human is. The Bible doesn't teach directly they have souls. It doesn't mention abortion outright. Therefore, there's room for mystery. And therefore, it could be the case that the decision should be left between a woman and her God because we just don't know. Well, we do know. And in previous episodes, we have talked about the overwhelming scientific evidence for this. In fact, we're going to come back at a future episode very shortly here, and we're going to look at one question, just science. What does the science of embryology say? I'll give you a preview that from the earliest stages, the unborn are members of the human family, and every embryology textbook in the world is going to back me up on that. And I'll actually bring the sources with me, hold them up so you can see them. This is not a mystery. It's only a mystery to people who are looking for a way to kind of nuance their views so they can still justify abortion somehow in light of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. We'll talk about all of that in a future episode coming up. Meanwhile, be sure to visit the sites that we are on social media. I want to thank our primary sponsor, the Life Training Institute, for being part of this. And I hope that you have found this show to be helpful in engaging others on the pro-life view. Like I said, in an upcoming episode, we're going to deal directly with the scientific evidence as we have on earlier episodes, but we're going to bring that into sharp focus. Look forward to seeing you the next time.